Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bloom Conversations. I'm Clare Dewhirst. I'm the Director of City Nation Place, which is the global forum for place branding and place marketing. I'm honoured that Bloom Consulting has invited me to join these podcast sessions just to introduce the discussions. I see my job as asking the questions on behalf of you to ensure that we learn the most from the Bloom experts and their guest speakers. This podcast series has been launched to celebrate Bloom's 20th anniversary. Happy birthday, Bloom. And throughout the series, we'll be diving into the world of nation branding and place branding. In each episode, we'll be looking at just one thing you could focus on to improve your nation or place brand strategy. In fact, in each episode, we'll be focusing on one of the 14 steps that Bloom have identified as being crucial to building an effective strategy. So just one thing today and 14 things over the series of conversations. So for this episode, I'm joined again by Jose Torres, the Chief Executive of Bloom Consulting. Hello, Jose.
Hello.
And welcome. And also by our special guest today, David Downs, who is the Chief Executive of New Zealand Story. Hi, David.
Kia ora, as we say here in New Zealand. Hello.
Great. Good to have you. And so New Zealand Story is, I saw it described as the ambitious organisation that presents and markets New Zealand to the rest of the world. So for this episode, we're going to talk about the seventh step, which is to be on brand and stay on brand. So let me turn to you first, Jose. Why is this so important?
Whenever we want to establish a perception or manage the reputation of a nation or a city, this cannot be done alone. It's not because you have one entity or one institution trying to manage a perception or trying to establish that central idea that we discussed on the previous step, on step 6, that is going to happen. It is something that can be established only if different stakeholders, society in general, are aligned with a central idea, or another way, if there's consistency among stakeholders, among players that are actually building or narrating the story of the nation or the city. This is one of the big differences between nation or place branding to consumer branding. Contrary to those types of branding, the nation brand or the city brand or the place brand is the delivery of a series of behaviors and a series of actions, activities, and policies delivered by these stakeholders in the nation, in the city, or in the region. And then, of course, you can market them, you can communicate that in a multitude of ways. So to summarize, Claire, it is really about that consistency of the touch points, it's the consistency of the narrative, and it's the consistency amongst stakeholders and the players that actually deliver that promise, deliver that brand idea.
That makes sense. And I know that that's a particular challenge. We hear lots of people asking us for examples of how places manage to deliver on this. So for you, David, is this topic a challenge for you? What have you learned about how to manage that?
Yeah, I think it's a great topic. When Jose was talking to me about this and I saw the methodology, it rings true. The reality is I could spend my entire organization's budget for the entire year and I could probably afford one billboard, in Shanghai for a week, so there's no way that no matter how well crafted our kind of thought is, our story is, and our place brand is, if we can't actually get it out there to the people we're trying to, show it to, then there's no point. And we can't do that by ourselves. As I say, we're too small. So to me, it's the obvious thing to do is to sit across the system. If I talk about New Zealand Story, for example, I describe us as a joint venture between all of the government agencies that interact internationally, because we're a country brand, and all of those government agencies, of which there's about 6 or 7, the trade bit, the tourism bit, the education bit, etc. All of them have come together and said, we need a consistent narrative and a consistent brand across all of us. And so me and my team's job is to firstly create that. And that's actually the easiest bit. I mean, that sounds terrible to say that. I don't really demean it, but the harder bit is then to get all of those agencies who've all got, hundreds of employees and trade posts around the world or whatever it might be, to get them to be consistent and coherent. Because the temptation is always there to them create their own little thing or generate their own version, etc. But in a country like ours, New Zealand's a relatively small population, we need consistency so that when the world interacts with a New Zealand agency from a government point of view or company from a private sector point of view, they get the same message. So it's consistency, and it's consistently going out there with the same messages, but to the point where it's boring for us, like that's when you've probably done it right, when you're sick of your own voice saying the same things over and over.
One of the biggest challenges is that relationship with politicians.
Yeah.
And I know you've had a change of government recently, but certainly during the pandemic, when I would say, and I think Jose would concur, that the brand of New Zealand seemed to go from strength to strength. A lot of that was down to the consistency of the messaging coming from Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah.
So how is that relationship between New Zealand's brand story and your politicians, your government?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That point you make there, actually, just before I answer your question, brings up another point, which is that a brand story only works if it's authentic and real. If we came out and said our New Zealand brand story is that we are the biggest and the best in the world, it's inauthentic, and all of those other agencies and people who are trying to, talk about the world, it just wouldn't come across. The reason the New Zealand brand story grew through the COVID thing, if it did, I think, was because the story we were telling was the authentic story of the country. What we say is we are a country where connection to the land and the place we're from and care for the people that are in it are the things that really motivate and drive our ingenuity. And when you saw our Prime Minister and how we had to behave, and many countries behaved, and he was sort of very authentic at the time, compassion for people, it was just on brand, and so therefore it came across very authentically. But to your question, we do put a bit of effort into making sure our political leaders and those who represent New Zealand internationally at least are aware of the work we do and hopefully subscribe to it. And then, the best case scenario is they're starting to use some of our material in our commentary. And we've been pretty successful in doing that over the last few years, actually. It's been great.
Yeah. And one of the ways that you get your private sector engaged with the brand is through the firm mark, isn't it? The licensing. Do you think that plays an important part in ensuring that consistency of storytelling?
I do. I mean, it's interesting, because, in the business, you guys are more expert at this than me. I'm a complete amateur at this whole brand building thing, but I'm sort of learning from people like you guys. And I know that one of the pieces of wisdom is a brand is not a logo. And we certainly believe that. But at the same time, we do have a logo. And for us, it's the fern mark. And what we've sort of discovered and research has told us is that the fern mark for New Zealand is actually globally quite well recognized, certainly more than our flag. And therefore, it is an asset for us. And we trademark it in 30 or 40 countries around the world. We have a licensing program where we license it out to exporters. We use it in our communications from government agencies, etc. And it's become, therefore, this sort of shorthand for the bigger brand story. So it's not the brand in and of itself, but it absolutely leans into the greater story that we are trying to tell, the story of a values-based country. And I think that works. So, yeah, it's not about creating a logo, but it is about actually giving sort of visual clues that allow people to, associate themselves with your country. And certainly for the private sector, as I mentioned, exporters, it's really valuable. Like, we're just seeing an ever increasing demand of companies who want to get that because it means something.
Based on what you're saying here, would you agree that, for instance, the licensing program, it's an opportunity and it's actually a way to train and to make sure that at least the ones that are embarking on the licensing program for the brand and, the visual identity is a very practical tool to help for everyone to be on brand, right? Because to join the licensing program especially probably for the consumer brands, and, they in the end are brand ambassadors. They also benefit from the reputation of the country, of course, but they are brand ambassadors and they also deliver that promise that we're talking here. Would you say that this is helpful to create that unison, to create this common narrative, this alignment, specifically on the private sector?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's how we sort of have designed the program. And, if anyone's listening wants to understand more about it, feel free to get in touch. Again, to the topic of this podcast, consistency is everything. So when people apply for the Fern Mark license to become a licensee, they go through a few little tests. We want to make sure that they really are a New Zealand organization, or their product or everything was either designed here or grown here or whatever it might be. There's a sort of a good character test. We sort of think about, is this the kind of company we want to be associated with us as a brand, as a country? And then it's that consistent and coherent message. Put it on your packaging, put it on your website. We do a lot of work to try and explain what the values are and how it relates. And we know that in many parts of the world, and particularly in Asia, actually, which is a big target market for New Zealand, that Asian market really does value being from New Zealand. And so that Fernmark is a shorthand for what the country stands for. I think it is valuable. Also that it's government. I mean, interestingly, when you talk about place branding, this is not all the case, but we are a government agency. So that we represent the New Zealand government, and in many parts of the world where they really respect kind of the rule of law, or what government stand for, that means something that you've got that government endorsement. Actually, we make pains to say that we're not really endorsing the company. What we're endorsing is the fact that they are grown or built or whatever here in New Zealand. But it certainly gives that implied credibility that sometimes particularly smaller exporters or smaller companies need. They need to be able to, puff their chests out a little bit, be bigger than they sometimes are in the international market, and it allows them to do that.
Can I ask something else about how you ensure that consistency across your stakeholders? You talked about structure with the government departments, and that makes perfect sense. And I guess other than the fan mark, you're providing them with a narrative, with not just a logo, but with this is the way we talk about ourselves.
Yeah.
How do you deliver that practically?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I talk about what we do as an agency, I say we do three things. We protect and grow the brand of the country. Number one. Number two is we tell stories and market the country in a way that kind of helps people understand who we are. And number three is we teach others how to do that. And it's on that third bit. The third bit is where we are working with companies to get them to understand what is the brand narrative. Our country does have a brand narrative. Here's why it's important for you. Our brand value, according to most recent report, is $280 billion. It's an incredible asset for you as a New Zealand business to use our brand. How do you associate yourself? And we'll teach them the kind of the language that we would use, the core values that sit behind it. So we have a whole value set that sits behind the brand. Very much a brand marketing mentality of being a values-based way of thinking. And then we also have some practical programs. So we've been doing training programs with exporters, teaching them how to use not only the brand of New Zealand, but their own storytelling in a more effective way, research-driven, understand your market, tailor your messaging to meet that market, weave in these core messages that we know work, that are tailored to particular international destinations. It's not particularly rocket science, but often those simple things are the things that some organizations miss. And then we provide them with toolkits of things like imagery and graphics and video content that they can use. Lowers the cost of entry for them, but also make sure that they're consistent. So some of those smaller exporters will use our content, weave it into their international marketing efforts, and then suddenly things start to look the same and feel not completely identical, but they look like they're from the same family.
Sure.
So that's the sort of model that we follow.
And speaking of family, your cities have over recent years begun to talk about themselves. And so Auckland obviously won our Place Brand Strategy of the Year award a few years ago. This year we have Christchurch speaking on the global conference about the new brand platform that they have been working on to tell their story.
Yeah.
And without wishing to overplug the conference, of course, you're going to be joining us to talk about that relationship between nation and city brands. So how does that work? As the cities start to establish and want to create their own identity on a global stage, how does that fit in with the New Zealand story?
Yeah, and again, going back to sort of the focus of this podcast about the consistency piece, I spend quite a bit of time on stakeholder relations, and cities are a part of that. I mean, effectively in New Zealand, we've probably got, I'm going to insult the rest of them, but we've probably got 3 cities that would really be putting themselves out there internationally. So we're not a huge country, but those 3, we would love them to be consistent with what we're trying to tell the world, because it's sort of silly for them to try and create a brand for one city when actually there's a country level recognition issue. And largely because of the size of the country, we can, I know them all personally. Our teams work together. We do film shoots together and that sort of thing. So we've got that. We are also very lucky in New Zealand in that we have a very strong Indigenous culture, the Māori culture, which unlocks a huge amount of value that I think we can show the world about what it is to be from a bicultural country. And each of those city brands has their own really interesting story in that bicultural space as well. So Christchurch's latest brand campaign, if you look at it, leans heavily into their creativity and innovation, but also their Māori population. And that's very consistent with the messaging that we give. The trick is We want them to be, and by the way, I'm not saying we're doing this perfectly by any means. I think we can still learn, but how do we be consistent that everything looks like it's coming from the same place, but allow for individuality? And we got to respect the fact that, Christchurch has got a job to do. They want to recruit people to move to Christchurch, for example. We want to inform the world what the country stands for. And I think all those things are possible. So consistency, coherency, and then just going back again and again and go, let's not keep changing stuff. We've got a plan. Let's stick to the plan. As I say, to the point where it gets boring sometimes. And that's a bit of a challenge, actually, because marketing people are, no disrespect to the marketers on the call, but boy, they love creating new things, don't they? They love a brief. They love creating a creative agency, and they like going out on shoots. And sometimes it's just the boring old, you go say, actually, we're not going to do all that. We've just got to just consistently tell the story we've already got, because that's how we're going to get the leverage.
We talk here a lot about from a messaging point of view, right? And here there's two interesting things that you said, I think, at the beginning. One is repeating yourself and going to all these institutions and making sure. We talked about the Denmark program, but you also talk about the other ministries. It sounds like you had to spend a lot of time also telling people what not to do, right? Of what is to be off brand, right? So that's one of the things. But also, I'm curious to know if you as an institution also play a role, for instance, on talking to policymakers to make sure that the policies they're currently developing for the country are aligned with that brand, or in other words, are on brand. Does the New Zealand story also work on this? And there's beyond just the marketing, but also from the branding perspective?
I would like to say we do, but I don't think we do it to the extent that we could. We definitely have good relationships, and we try and make sure that the brand is not just something. I mean, I have this personal belief, and maybe I've just got overinflated ego, but I actually think part of our responsibility is not just to demonstrate and talk about the brand, it's actually to help to create it and bring it to life. And a good example for us in New Zealand is globally, our reputation is very high on things like, we're seen as a very clean, green economy, good for the environment, sustainable, etc. And it's a wonderful reputation to have, at the risk of really kind of throwing ourselves under a bus as a country. The reality is that we're not actually as good as everyone thinks we are. And frankly, we could do better. We need to do better in terms of sustainability and water rights, etc. And so I sort of, as part of my role, see it that I give myself this mandate. No one's given it to me necessarily, but I insert myself into conversations where those things are being discussed to remind our policymakers and our politicians that we actually do need to do a better job of living up to our own reputation, that you can't just let the world assume that we're perfect. It's green hushing in terms of, not saying something and hoping that people won't notice. And in fact, we need to do a better job. And that's worked pretty well, actually. We're definitely within the government system in New Zealand, I think, welcomed into those conversations, partly because I'm able to stand in front of people and go, look, this is not my humble personal opinion. This is what the research is telling us. They're telling us that we're seen good at this and bad at that. We need to do better at this, and we need to tone this up and change this. And that research, I call it our right to operate, So yeah, being able to go back into the policymakers and being able to hold them up, show them what we're doing, and actually help shape that, I think is part of what we need to do. I don't think we're doing it as well as we could, and I certainly learn from others. I always eagerly read the work that you both put out, both your organizations, because I think we can learn from other agencies and organizations. But I do think it's part of our responsibility. We're not just a marketing department of the country whose job is to create posters and everyone else actually does the work.
And inspire them, right? And inspire them and
Inspire them, yeah. Yeah, and it's, our country does stand for something. We want the values to be aspirational. We want them to be anchored in reality, but they are a bit aspirational. That's like any brand. And therefore, we've got to live up to that aspiration.
Very good.
So, David, you've told us everything you're doing, which, it's all very impressive. And I know you say you're not doing it well, but I think Jose and I would both argue that it's being done very well in New Zealand. But do you have any questions for Jose around how he sees other places succeeding in delivering that consistency?
I mean, it's so interesting being in roles like ours, isn't it? Particularly, all the other country brand people or brands and place people around the world. We're hungry to learn from each other because we're just feeling our way in the dark sometimes. And Jose, you must see opportunities. You're going back to, again, the purpose of the podcast, talk about that consistency. Are there organizations or people around the world where you think they've really got it nailed and kind of everyone's swimming in the same direction, all the messaging is coherent, the stakeholder relationship's going perfectly and everyone knows their role? Or are we all on the same journey of trying to get our stakeholders lined up?
As long as we're humans, this will never happen. So maybe when the world will be completely ruled by AI, then that's a different thing. But as long as we're humans, no, these are the things. And I'm asked a lot about exactly that same question. Like, is it just us? And the answer to that is exactly that. No, there's no perfect case. And basically everything is okay up until the moment that you start to need to escalate the project to other institutions. So again, hence the importance of this
Yeah.
conversation about the being on brand and staying on brand. Every time you escalate or you go outside the first circle, the first ring of nation brand builders that actively work on the brand, that's when the managing challenges start to happen. So there is no perfect nation brand case study. People may think that if it's a smaller country, it's easier to manage, specifically the nation brand project. I would disagree. That's not a rule. Sometimes you can, but I've also seen and worked with very big nations that they may sound that is very difficult, but in the end, you'll be surprised how difficult it is to manage. It's a small nation that is very, a big nation, or someone that I think they have that strong idea on how to manage it. So I think it's just a question of time and process. So I think the more and more this happens because the managing a nation brand is, number one, is very much confused with marketing and nation marketing
Yeah.
alone, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes people think, oh, it's just the tourism promotion, it's just that billboard that you were talking about. And the other part is also because it's a relatively new practice, if you like. And whenever you talk to stakeholders, they're listening to this for the first time. When you build a boat, when you build an infrastructure, when there's an urban planning and so on, I'm not saying it's not challenging, but everyone knows what's a master plan, or everyone knows what is a building or a bridge and so on. Right? When we talk about nation brand, you're trying to manage something that's on people's minds, or they think it's something that is completely different. When I say people, I mean the stakeholders that manage the brand. That's why it's important to keep on telling, explaining, having this podcast, as hearing from you and others, sharing information. That is what will make this, to mitigate that, let's just put it this way,
Yeah.
is the sharing of information.
That's good. That's good to hear. It's good to hear. I guess the other thing I'd just add to that is, and maybe it's my defense mechanism, but I tell people that I think building a brand, particularly for a nation, is a 30 to 50 year project.
Mhm.
And we're about 10 years in, if that. And so we will start to see the results of our work in another 10 years. And then we'll reap the benefits of it 10 years later, which is hard to wrap your head around if you're a government agency and people are funding you. But I do think brands take a long time to build, and consistency, coherent messaging, repetition is so critical. That's why I think, that the podcast today is absolutely correct. It's about making sure we're all telling the same consistent, coherent story over a long period of time.
Yeah, what is your one thing that people should do to ensure that they have that consistency, that they are on brand?
Well, my experience is that the one thing is to learn who your key stakeholders are. And then if you're in a position like I am, I see my job as just to go around all of those stakeholders like once every month or 2 months and just keep reminding them of what we're doing and why. And let my team actually do the job of developing and telling the story. And my job is just to make sure the stakeholders are all on board with us the whole time. So that's my one thing, consistency.
And Jose, what would be your one thing?
I would say I agree with David. I think one of the things that is important is to give tools for people to understand on how to be on brand and stay on brand, right? So I think more is coming from a conceptual point of view to giving practical tools on how to be on brand and stay on brand, right? So I think, one of the things that nations and cities can use and can do to help them is creating what we call the on and off brand filters. So the on and off filters is kind of a guide, if you like, that can be done in many ways, which can be a software, can be an app, can be a Word document that asks a series of questions for non-experts. So someone that does not know what a nation brand is, just questions to say, hey, are you acting like this? Are you saying this? When we say consistency, I mean more than visually, as we discussed from a storytelling perspective, but really a series of questions that can even be okay from a structural point of view and from a communication point of view, if they are on brand. And so having this tool, the on and off brand filter, is a very practical and handy tool that will help stakeholders and the ones that are responsible for building this perception of the nation to be on brand.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, both of you, so much for your advice today.
Thank you.
And thanks, David, for so honestly sharing your approach in New Zealand. I think there's a lot to learn for everyone else. Thank you so much for your time, David.
Really appreciate it. What a great chat. Thank you so much, both of you. I can't wait to actually meet you both in person and we can sit over a glass of wine and talk about this stuff for hours.
I look forward to it, David. I'm a great believer in meeting in person. And thank you for listening. I hope you'll be tuning in for the next episode of Bloom Conversations, where one thing at a time we'll be exploring Bloom's 14 steps to successful nation and place branding. In the next episode, we'll be looking at auditing and activating brand touchpoints. In the meantime, on the Bloom website page where you found this podcast, you'll see our recommendations for further reading to help you in your approach to building and managing the reputation of your nation or place brand.